In 1891, 6 cowboys herded cattle through the Curse of Dick Canyons in Monument Valley. They listened to the dead calling out to them and observed tracks transforming from human to animal. Just a single man lived to recount what pursued them through the Red Rock night. Please subscribe. On both sides, the canyon walls loomed like crimson-stained fangs, rugged and age-old, shining orange under the setting sun. We herded 300 cattle through the tight gorge. Their hooves raised dust that lingered in the calm air, similarly to smoke. I positioned myself at the rear of the herd, one hand resting on my rifle while keeping watch on the high cliffs. The path across Monument Valley offered the quickest way to the Colorado railhead, yet it was also the most desolate. For 5 days we traveled through Red Rock territory, where water was hard to find and the silence felt heavy as a burden. In the fall of 1891, I was 26 years old, employed as a cattle driver for the Double J Ranch, based in Moab. This ranch was owned by Jacob Thornton, a tough individual who offered decent pay and never inquired about your past. I had enlisted half a year before, desperate for employment and eager to vanish into a land where I was unknown. The journey to Colorado was expected to last 14 days, provided the weather cooperated and the cattle remained calm. It was meant to be ordinary, yet it turned out to be the opposite. We numbered 6. Mr. Thornton, a man in his 50s sporting a gray mustache and constantly evaluating eyes, headed the drive. He had completed this route over a dozen times and was familiar with every stream and gap. Riding next to him was Clay Brennan. As the foreman, a lanky Texan bearing a scar on his cheek and known for maintaining discipline, he seldom talked, yet earned respect simply by being there. Additionally, Miguel Santos, a Mexican cowboy, could lasso any moving creature and understood the desert more intimately than most people knew their own property. Bringing up the rear with me were 2 younger fellows. Ben Tucker, just 20 years old, with an easy smile and a habit of chattering excessively. Samuel Weaver, a reserved Kansan, stored a Bible in his saddlebag and perused it each evening. As trail hands, we handled the messy job of urging on stragglers and swallowing dust, while the others covered the front and sides. The labor was tough but profitable, and no one voiced any grievances. I noticed the initial indication on day 2. We had set up camp in a box canyon where a slender creek seeped through the stones, just sufficient to hydrate the cattle, though it was better than having nothing. The herd settled down for the night, and we lit a fire within a circle of rocks. Miguel prepared beans and coffee, while the rest of us looked after the horses and inspected the spare mounts. The sun sank below the canyon's edge, and night descended quickly, as is typical in the desert. In just 60 minutes, the mercury dropped by about 11 degrees Celsius, prompting us to button up our jackets. Ben drew the first shift, circling the herd on horseback, while humming gently to soothe the animals. I remained seated by the flames, sipping coffee, when I caught his voice, not a yell, merely an inquiry. His words traveled through the camp. "Who's out there?" Every one of us raised our heads. Clay rose and seized his rifle. Ben rode nearer to the campfire. With a puzzled expression, he reported seeing a person strolling along the canyon edge, outlined against the stars. He added that the shape had been observing him before vanishing behind a boulder. Clay inquired about its appearance. Ben replied he wasn't sure, only that it was a figure moving bipedally. Thornton remarked it was likely a Navajo shepherd tending to his herd. Since we were near the reservation boundary, we could anticipate encountering people. He instructed us to stay vigilant, but only fire if provoked. Miguel remained silent, yet I observed his gaze fixed on the canyon rim, his jaw clenched. Weaver inquired about setting a double guard. Thornton declined, stating we would maintain the usual shift schedule and conserve our energy for the journey. Yet I couldn't dismiss the sense that something was amiss. The canyon seemed excessively silent. No coyotes, no owls, only the movement of cattle and the fires crackling. The cliff faces appeared to tilt inward, enclosing us, and the shadows beyond the campfire seemed animated. I assumed the second watch, riding a leisurely loop around the herd, one hand on my rifle, eyes sweeping the rocks. I spotted nothing, yet on 2 occasions I detected footsteps, gentle and purposeful, emanating from the dark beyond the campsite. Each time I rode toward the noise, it ceased. As I turned away, the sound resumed. Dawn offered no explanations. At daybreak, we dismantled camp and drove the herd further into the canyon. The walls rose taller, the route became more constricted, and sunlight scarcely touched the ground. We traveled amidst shade and rust-hued rock, the cattle lowing discontentedly, the horses uneasy. Around noon, Miguel discovered the footprints. He dismounted and crouched next to a stretch of soft sand beside the creek. He summoned Clay, and we assembled to examine his discovery. The imprints appeared human, or nearly so, barefoot with 5 toes, yet the proportions were off. The foot was excessively long, the toes splayed too widely, and the heel had sunk deeper than a man's weight could account for. Miguel gauged the print with his hand and declared it roughly 35.5 centimeters in length. Clay wondered if it might belong to a native walking barefoot. Miguel shook his head, stating that no one went barefoot in this terrain, not among rocks and cacti. He noted the stride was too extended. The maker of these prints had been running. Thornton commanded us to proceed. He claimed the prints were old, likely several days old, and unrelated to us. However, the prints were recent, their borders were crisp, and the sand adjacent was undisturbed. They followed the creek for about 91 meters, then ascended the canyon wall at a slope that would be impossible without ropes. Miguel followed the trail with his gaze and made the sign of the cross. He muttered something in Spanish, hushed and rapid, then he mounted his horse in silence. We continued onward throughout the afternoon, and the canyon broadened into a valley encircled by mesas. The terrain was sandy, scattered with juniper and sagebrush. We set up camp beside a grove of cottonwoods where the creek formed a shallow pool. The cattle drank sufficiently, and we arranged our sleeping rolls in a circle around the campfire. The sunset painted the rocks a blood-red hue, and the stars emerged crisp and frigid. We dined in quietude, each man absorbed in his own reflections. Ben assumed the first watch once more, and I attempted to sleep, yet the stillness prevented it. This wasn't a tranquil quiet, it was the hush of something biding its time, poised. At approximately midnight, Ben shouted once more, his tone strained. "Jacob, come look at this." We hurried out of our sleeping bags and seized our firearms. Ben had dismounted and was at the camp's perimeter, gesturing toward the boulders. We looked where he indicated and noticed those lights, tiny, wavering flames tracking the mesa's edge, resembling lanterns borne by a procession. Thornton tallied 7 lights, uniformly spaced and moving in flawless coordination. The lights progressed gradually and purposefully before halting. We observed them for an entire minute, and they remained motionless. Clay suggested it might be a Navajo ritual and advised against interfering. Miguel disagreed, stating it was no ceremony. Miguel remarked that those lights were positioned too high, too distant from any path, and their movement seemed unnatural. Weaver recommended that we pray. Thornton advised us to disregard the lights and remain vigilant. The lights extinguished simultaneously, as though someone had snuffed out 7 candles at once. The subsequent darkness seemed denser than previously, and none of us rested soundly. We rotated guard duty, and each man claimed to have heard noises. They perceived footsteps in the sand, stones tumbling from the precipices, and distant voices emanating from the gloom. Weaver insisted he heard a low chant sung in an unfamiliar tongue. Clay attributed it to the wind deceiving us. Yet there was no breeze. The atmosphere was motionless and chilly, and the noises persisted until daybreak. We packed up camp rapidly and drove the cattle relentlessly, anxious to exit the valley. The livestock were nervous, breaking ranks and attempting to reverse direction. It required all 6 of us to maintain their forward progress. By midday, we arrived at a narrow gorge flanked by 2 lofty mesas. The cliffs were vertical and confining, casting deep shadows. Midway through, Miguel's horse became startled. The horse reared up, throwing Miguel off, then fled back along our route. Miguel struck the ground forcefully and remained motionless briefly before rising and swearing in Spanish. We alighted to examine him. He was contused, but had no fractures. Clay inquired what had frightened the horse. Miguel gestured toward the cliff to our left. Incised into the rock at eye level were symbols, not old petroglyphs, but recent carvings sunk deeply into the stone. They were circular, with rays emanating outward like a sun or star, and they recurred every 3 meters along the face. Thornton speculated they were likely indicators from a surveying team. However, Miguel disagreed, asserting the marks were cautions. Miguel claimed his people recognized these symbols. They designated locations where misfortune occurred, where spirits roamed. Ben gave a nervous laugh and accused Miguel of attempting to frighten us. Miguel remained serious, proposing that we turn around and seek an alternative path because this location felt wrong. Thornton responded that we had already wasted half the day and couldn't spare time to go back. Thornton insisted we continue and set up camp beyond the pass. Clay concurred, while Weaver remained silent, simply gripping his Bible. I examined the symbols once more, and a shudder, unrelated to the temperature, ran through me. We got on our horses and resumed our journey. We spent the night in the open, staying clear of the cliffs beneath a sky densely packed with stars. The stars seemed to weigh down upon us. We kept a large fire blazing by, continuously adding fuel, and we sat huddled near the heat. The cattle grew uneasy, mooing and moving about, while the horses tugged at their tether lines. Thornton assured us that if we maintained our current speed, we'd arrive at the railhead in another 4 days. He reminded us we had completed this route previously, and there was no reason for concern. Still, his tone betrayed uncertainty, and I noticed his hand hovering close to his revolver. Then, around midnight, it occurred. We heard voices that were neither faint nor far away, but distinct and nearby. Someone was shouting our names. I recognized my own name, uttered in a tone eerily similar to my father's, who had passed away 5 years ago. Ben could hear his mother summoning him, and Weaver could hear his brother. The cries emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, desperately asking us to approach. We remained motionless, our rifles ready, peering into the gloom. The voices ceased as abruptly as they began, and thereafter, the stillness was complete. There was no breeze, no livestock noise, no sound whatsoever, only the fire's crackle and the heavy breathing of 6 men. We realized that an entity existed out there, and it was aware of our presence. Sleep evaded us. We formed a circle around the fire, back to back, with rifles resting on our legs, keeping an eye on the blackness. Each noise startled us, whether it was the sharp sound of a rock contracting from the cold, the lizard scurrying through bushes, or an owl's remote hoot. However, the voices never came back. In time, the cattle calmed down, but they remained tightly clustered, their eyes gleaming with the fire's reflection. The horses stayed agitated, with pinned ears and flared nostrils. Thornton announced that we would depart at daybreak, regardless of our fatigue, and that swiftness was now our greatest protection. At last, morning arrived, overcast and chilly, and we discovered footprints. They formed a complete circle around our camp, a ring of those same bizarre impressions sunk deeply into the sand. This time, however, the tracks had altered. Close to the camp's eastern side, they transformed from human barefoot prints into what appeared to be canine prints, big, with clear claw marks. Then, roughly 6 meters further on, they reverted to barefoot prints. Miguel knelt next to the transition spot, examining the signs carefully. Miguel declared it impossible for any animal to change its footprints in such a manner. Clay suggested that perhaps 2 distinct beings had been circling our camp. Miguel glanced at Clay and insisted that it was a single creature that underwent the transformation. Thornton ordered an immediate pack-up. We silently saddled the horses, moving hastily and anxiously. Ben repeatedly looked back over his shoulder toward the desert, stretching out past the camp. Weaver's eyes were shadowed with dark circles, and he whispered prayers while working. Clay inspected all weapons, verifying that rifles were loaded and pistols were clean. We mounted our horses and began driving the cattle northeast, away from the mesas towards open terrain where we could spot any approaching threat. The morning remained silent, except for the sounds of the herd and our own mounts. The terrain gradually changed. Fewer red rocks, more sandy plains dotted with sagebrush and greasewood. The sun climbed higher, the temperature rose, yet the sense of unease did not lift. Around late morning, Ben rode up alongside me and asked if I believed what Miguel had said about the tracks shifting. I replied that I didn't know what to believe. He recounted that just before the voices began last night, he had spotted something. A silhouette stood at the edge of the firelight, but vanished when he blinked. He suggested it might have been his imagination, and I agreed it could be. At midday, we stopped to water the herd at a shallow depression filled with rainwater. While the cattle drank, Miguel rode ahead to scout the trail. He was gone for 20 minutes, and when he returned, his face was deathly pale. He stated that something ahead required our attention. Thornton and Clay rode out with him, and they gestured for the rest of us to follow. We left Ben with the herd and rode about 400 meters to where the land dipped into a dry gully. At the center lay a circle of stones, deliberately placed, each the size of a human head. Inside the circle were bones, not animal, but human. A skull, ribs, and long arm and leg bones arranged in a star pattern. The bones were old and sun-bleached white, yet had been placed there recently, as the surrounding sand was freshly disturbed. Thornton dismounted and walked to the circle's edge but did not enter. He said it was probably an ancient burial site and we should leave it alone and ride around. Miguel countered that it was not a burial. He said it was a warning. Clay asked what kind of warning. Miguel replied that it was the kind telling us to leave, that this land was claimed by something that didn't want us here. Weaver said we should pray over the bones and give them a proper blessing. Thornton said we didn't have time for that. He said we would note the location and report it to the authorities when we reached Colorado. He declared we were moving on. We mounted up and gave the circle a wide berth, but I couldn't stop looking at those bones. They were arranged so carefully, so deliberately someone or something had put them there for us to find. We rejoined Ben and the herd, and Thornton pushed us hard for the rest of the day. By nightfall, we had covered about 13 kilometers, more than we usually manage, and made camp on a rocky rise with good visibility in all directions. Thornton said no more box canyons or narrow passes. We would camp in the open where we could see anything coming. We built the fire and set a watch rotation, but this time we posted 2 men at once. Clay and I took the first shift. We stood on opposite sides of the camp, rifles ready, scanning the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see shapes moving in the distance. Twice, I saw what looked like a figure walking along a ridgeline about 90 meters away. I called out, "Who goes there?" No answer. The figure stopped, turned toward me, then moved behind a rock and didn't reappear. I told Clay, and he said he had seen it too. He said we should wake Thornton. I suggested we hold our ground and observe if it approached, but it never did. After an hour on watch, we heard laughter emanating from the south, shrill and piercing, reminiscent of a child's laugh, yet distorted unnatural, as if forced and derisive. The sound reverberated throughout the desert, ricocheting off boulders, so its origin was impossible to locate. Then it ceased. 10 seconds later, the laughter originated from the north, next from the west, then right behind us, so near that I whirled around, rifle at the ready. There was nothing. The laughter erupted once more from every side, simultaneously, enveloping us, and then stopped abruptly. The ensuing silence was suffocating. Clay roused the rest of the group. We gathered around the campfire, weapons in hand, intently listening. Thornton suggested it could be coyotes, noting they can produce sounds similar to human speech. Miguel countered that no coyote would laugh in that manner. He stated that we were being stalked, that the entity circling us was probing our defenses, attempting to shatter our resolve. Ben inquired about our next move. Thornton ordered us to remain together, keep our weapons ready, and not abandon the campfire. He said that at daybreak we would head directly to the nearest settlement, some 48 kilometers to the north, to seek assistance. Yet the settlement might as well have been 161 kilometers away. The assaults began shortly after midnight, not physical attacks, but something far worse. The voices came back, this time more distinct and urgent. I heard my father's voice calling my name, saying he was injured, needing assistance, and insisting I must go to him. I was aware it wasn't genuine. My father had passed away, yet the voice was flawless, every nuance, every pitch correctly mimicked. I remained standing, rifle trembling in my grasp, tears streaming down my cheeks, and stayed still. Ben lacked the same fortitude. He heard his mother's voice calling, weeping, pleading for him to come find her. He got up and moved one step into the dark before Clay seized him and wrestled him to the ground. Ben resisted, yelling that his mother required him and he must go. Clay pinned him down and struck him forcefully across the cheek. "That isn't your mother," Clay declared. "Your mother is back in Texas, and that entity out there is attempting to kill you." Ben went limp and began to weep. Weaver dropped to his knees next to him and offered a prayer. Then the entity addressed all of us simultaneously in a non-human voice that resembled stones grinding against bone. It uttered our names slowly, one after another, and claimed it had been observing us ever since we entered the canyon. It stated it knew our fears, our loves, and our losses. It offered us a choice: leave, retreat, forsake the cattle and ride off, or remain and be taken one by one. The voice emanated from all directions, and none simultaneously. And when it ceased, the night fell silent once more. Thornton took charge. He declared that we would not turn back, that we had an agreement to honor. He stated that the cattle represented thousands of dollars in value, and abandoning them would destroy his reputation. He reminded us that we were armed, seasoned men, and that neither beast nor spirit would frighten us away. Clay gave his consent, but I could see uncertainty in his gaze. Miguel called Thornton a fool, insisting that wealth was meaningless if we were all dead. Thornton told Miguel he could go if he wished, but Miguel refused to desert the others. Thus, we remained and made it through the night by huddling near the flames. We ignored their calls. They shouted for hours, begging, threatening, crying, but we gave no reply. We remained motionless. At first light, the voices ceased, and we discovered additional tracks encircling the camp. This time they were nearer, within about 6 meters of where we had slept. Among the footprints were traces of dragging, as though someone had been hauling a corpse through the sand. We silently dismantled camp and began moving the cattle northward. Both the cattle and we were utterly worn out. Ben slumped forward in the saddle, hardly uttering a word. Weaver droned scripture without pause, his voice a quiet mutter. Miguel scanned the ridges with the sharp focus of a hawk. Clay kept near Thornton, and I overheard their hushed dispute. The debate was whether to push on or abandon the cattle and ride for assistance. Thornton prevailed in the debate, so we pressed forward. Shortly after midday, we suffered our first loss, a man. Ben had gone ahead to locate a water source that Miguel recalled from earlier trips. He was due back in 20 minutes. 40 minutes elapsed before Thornton dispatched Clay and me to search. We rode to the narrow canyon where the spring was believed to be, and there we found Ben's horse alone, reins trailing, its eyes rolling with fear. There was no trace of Ben. We shouted his name and combed through the rocky terrain. We searched for footprints and discovered a few drops of blood on a rock, along with a scrap of fabric torn from Ben's shirt. That was all. After 2 hours of searching, Thornton recalled us. He stated that we couldn't spare any further delay. Perhaps Ben had taken a fall and struck his head, wandering about disoriented, but we would send assistance once we reached the settlement. Miguel insisted Ben would never return. The entity had claimed him, as it had threatened. Weaver collapsed in tears, lamenting that we should not have taken this route and had disregarded the warnings. Thornton ordered him to be quiet, to get on his horse, and to continue onward. We obeyed, but we all recognized Miguel's truth. Ben was lost, and the creature still trailed us, now aware that it could seize any of us at will. We pushed on relentlessly for the remainder of the day, driving the herd until they staggered with fatigue. Thornton made no mention of Ben, his gaze locked on the northern skyline. The terrain became increasingly barren, vast plains of alkaline dust interrupted by sharp rock formations, resembling shattered fangs. The sun blazed without pity, and by afternoon we were all tormented by thirst. Our water supply was almost depleted, and the next known water source remained about 16 kilometers ahead. Miguel rode alongside Thornton and urged that we halt. The horses would collapse without rest. According to Thornton, we would rest once we arrived at the spring. Miguel, however, doubted we would make it that far. Thornton twisted in his saddle and stared at Miguel with hollow eyes. He then said that some of us would not survive, but we had to keep moving. Clay stepped in, arguing that dead horses would leave us all on foot, and that would mean death for everyone. Thornton finally conceded. We halted under the shadow of a mesa and gave the horses the tiny amount of water that was left. While the animals were resting, Weaver walked a short distance away from the group and knelt down on the sand. He opened his Bible and started reading out loud, his voice echoing across the desert. Thornton told him to be silent. Noise carries too far out here. Weaver ignored him and kept reciting verses about deliverance and protection, about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. His voice became louder and more desperate. Then he stopped in the middle of a sentence. We looked over and saw him staring at something in the distance. On the rim of the mesa, a figure stood silhouetted against the bright sky. It was extremely tall, with limbs that appeared too long and proportions that seemed wrong. It stood completely still, watching us. We grabbed our rifles and aimed, but it was too far away to shoot accurately. Clay shouted, demanding to know who it was. The figure did not answer. It slowly turned its head, as if studying each of us one by one, then took a step backward and disappeared behind the ridge. We waited for it to reappear. It never did. Thornton ordered us to get back on the horses. We left the cattle where they were. They were too tired to wander off and rode toward the mesa to investigate. It took about 15 minutes to reach the base, where we found a narrow trail going upward. Clay and Miguel dismounted and climbed on foot, with their rifles ready. Thornton, Weaver, and I waited below, watching the rim. About 5 minutes later, Clay called down with a shaky voice, saying we needed to come up. We climbed and found them standing at the edge of a natural platform below us. Carved into the rock face were dozens of symbols, the same radiating circles we had seen before, but larger, covering the whole cliff. And among them were shapes that looked like men, but twisted and bent at unnatural angles, with heads of animals, coyotes, wolves, and bears. Miguel said these carvings were old, very old, but the meaning was obvious. This was a place where skinwalkers roamed, where men turned into beasts, and beasts turned into men. He said we were now in the heart of their territory and should never have come. Thornton said we were leaving not just the mesa, but everything. He said we would abandon the cattle, keep the horses, and ride straight north to the settlement. Without stopping, he said, we would make it by dawn if we pushed through the night. Clay asked about the contract, and Thornton told him to hell with the money, that we would die if we stayed. Miguel agreed, and Weaver was already heading down the trail. I joined the others, and we swiftly got on our horses. However, we were too late. Upon arriving at the spot where we had left the herd, they had disappeared. All 300 cattle were gone. The ground was disturbed. Hoofprints crisscrossed in every direction, but there was no obvious trail. It appeared the cows had fled in terror, bolting simultaneously in every possible way. Thornton circled on his horse, swearing as he attempted to locate a track. Clay remarked that it was inconceivable for so many beasts to vanish that rapidly. Miguel claimed that in this place, nothing was beyond belief. He explained the Skinwalker had scattered them, desiring us to be marooned, defenseless, simple targets. With no alternative, we headed north on horses 5 men, our provisions shrinking and fear mounting. As we journeyed, the sun descended, dyeing the desert crimson, and the cold set in abruptly. We traveled without words, our mounts exhausted, our composure unraveling. Near midnight, Weaver's steed tripped and collapsed. Weaver was tossed off safely, but the horse remained down. It had a broken leg. Weaver crouched next to it, sobbing uncontrollably. Clay was compelled to euthanize the beast with 1 bullet, the sound resonating through the barren landscape. Weaver shared Miguel's horse, and we pressed on, yet losing that animal hindered our pace, and the night grew ever more intense. The moon ascended, round and luminous, but rather than offering solace, it intensified the blackness and made the terrain seem more foreign. We traversed an area of hoodoo's lofty stone columns resembling robed entities rendering verdicts. The breeze strengthened, wailing amid the structures, and within that wail we once more perceived voices, our own names, murmured, reiterated, reverberating from all sides. Suddenly, Clay's horse bucked upward, flinging him off. He struck the earth forcefully and lay dazed briefly. We got off to assist him, and at that moment, we got our first unobstructed view of it. The Skinwalker stood approximately 46 meters away. Bathed in moonlight, it had a humanoid form but was coated in uneven fur, its appendages excessively elongated, its hands terminating in talons. Its head was grotesque. A coyote's cranium stretched across a human visage, the jaw slack, eyes emitting a faint yellow luminescence. It stood upright on 2 legs, rocking gently, observing us. We lifted our guns and discharged them simultaneously, the 4 of us. The blasts were ear-splitting, and we observed at least 2 impacts. Dust erupted from its torso. Yet it did not collapse. It advanced a stride toward us, then another, progressing with a spasmodic, abnormal motion. We shot once more, emptying our weapons. The entity faltered, but continued forward. Then it unhinged its jaws and emitted a scream, a noise, half human, half beast, a shriek that caused our ears to ache and our sight to swim. Then it rushed at us. We fled, leaped onto our steeds, and spurred them into a full run, charging recklessly through the night. Miguel's horse tripped, casting him and Weaver off. Miguel yelled for us to continue and save ourselves. Thornton wheeled his mount around, conflicted between preserving his own life and his sense of obligation. Clay seized Thornton's reins and yanked him onward. "They are lost," Clay hollered. "There's nothing we can do for them." We sped away furiously, that unnatural howl pursuing us, and never glanced backward. We galloped for many hours, the animals frothing at the mouth, our chests aching. When we eventually halted, it was because the horses were incapable of proceeding any further. We found ourselves in an empty expanse. No shelter, no water, no optimism. Only 3 individuals and 2 collapsing mounts beneath a moon that seemed a reproachful gaze. Thornton climbed down and dropped to his knees, confessing that he had caused the deaths of all Ben, Miguel, and Weaver by not choosing to go back when it was still possible. Clay insisted it wasn't his fault the creature would have chased us, regardless of our actions. I remained silent, my eyes fixed on the desert behind us, anticipating its reappearance. A gray and chilly dawn crept in. Shortly after sunrise, the horses collapsed one by one, their hearts failing without warning. We gathered everything we could carry: canteens, ammunition, knives, and headed north. Thornton estimated the settlement was roughly 24 kilometers away, maybe less. He told us that walking non-stop until evening would get us there. Clay countered that we wouldn't last another night. Thornton insisted we had no alternative. For hours we trudged beneath the scorching sun. The desert heat made everything ripple, and twice I mistook mirages for actual water. Thornton started falling back, struggling to breathe. Clay and I slowed down to keep pace with him, and it was obvious he was deteriorating. Around midday, he collapsed. We pulled him into the shade of a boulder and offered him water. After drinking, he stated he couldn't continue and urged us to abandon him. Clay declared we would not leave another person behind. Thornton gave a faint smile and told us the decision wasn't ours to take that night. At sunset, we spotted the settlement's lights in the distance, flickering lanterns and chimney smoke rising. We were within less than 3.2 kilometers. Thornton had lost consciousness, so Clay and I alternated carrying him. Stumbling along, dehydrated and utterly exhausted, we pressed on. As the settlement drew nearer, I permitted myself to hope that we might actually make it. That's when we heard something behind us: footsteps, not running, but steady and purposeful. We refused to turn around. We simply kept going, hauling Thornton while our legs burned with agony. The footsteps drew closer. Now I could hear breathing wet and labored. Clay ordered, "Get to the settlement." "I'll hold it off," I said. "No." He pushed me onward, spun around, and lifted his rifle. I heard 3 shots, then his scream, then silence. I continued pulling Thornton, tears flowing down my cheeks, determined not to glance back. I arrived at the settlement by myself, still dragging his body. He had passed away sometime during the last 1.6 kilometers, and I hadn't even realized. The settlers rushed over, inquiring what had occurred and where the rest of the group was. I fell to the ground, unable to utter a word. They brought me indoors, provided water, and dressed my injuries. The following day, I recounted everything: the voices, the tracks, the creature. They listened without uttering a sound. I noticed the look of familiarity in their eyes. They recognized these tales. A search team set out the next morning and discovered nothing. No corpses, no footprints, no trace of Clay, Miguel Weaver, or Ben. Only the barren desert and sun-whitened stones remained. The cattle were never recovered, and the company attributed the loss to natural disasters, drought, illness, or a stampede. No official account acknowledged the true events or the men who perished. I departed Utah and never looked back, relocated eastward, secured employment distant from the desert, and attempted to erase the memories, but I am unable to. Those voices in the dark still call out my name. In my dreams, I keep seeing that creature, poised at the firelight's edge, as the Navajo call it, a skinwalker. This entity is a witch that wears animal skins and pursues those who venture onto sacred territory. I cannot be certain that was its true identity. I only know it was genuinely real and that it murdered my friends. It still lingers out there, hidden within Utah's red canyons. It is waiting for the next group of men who are reckless enough to disregard the warnings.